resume.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I'm now going to turn the witness's attention to the document at tab 16 of my list of documents, and it's a proceeding of the National Workshop on Objectives and Indicators for Ecosystem-Based Management that occurred in Sydney, BC in February into March of 2001. And it appears by my review of the participants that they are primarily DFO scientists, if that's correct.
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
And if I could turn you to page 11 of that document to begin with, there's a list of issues that these scientists have developed as associated with ecosystem-based management. And I want to turn you to the very first one to begin with. Science must be able to provide indicators and reference points at regionally relevant scales. And and then it goes on to social and economic objectives and indicators need to be addressed in concert with the biological ones also being considered. My question for you is, why is it that science feels that they have to provide the indicators? Why isn't that somewhat dependent on the management questions and the stakeholders and First Nations interests on how this information is going to be used? And wouldn't it be more useful to ensure that there's a collaborative group of people that are coming to some kind of agreement as it's associated with indicators and reference points?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement as far as it goes. This particular group met in 2001 and made a conscious decision to only look at what they called the environmental part of the question, not the cultural or social or anything else. They then moved forward, tried to build a framework which would be useful, remembering that this was early on in these discussions. We're going back 10 years. The indicators and reference points that they are referring to, that they think science should provide, are basically, in the context of what they're talking about, are things that science would look at and measure in some way, either directly or indirectly through outputs from models, whether they're physical, biological, in terms of lower trophic level biological, or upper scale biological. So I don't think they were suggesting in any way that when it came to the actual development of ecosystem objectives and how you would use, they actually, in more recent work, talk about setting out, well, I forget the actual term, but it would be management indicators as opposed to biological or science indicators. So I think this is more a reflection of when they wrote this paper as opposed to their thoughts on it.
All right, and then if you go to the fifth bullet down, they talk about funding challenges, and in fact they say that funding opportunities within DFO for terms longer than the existing 2 to 3 year minimum or maximum window needs to be created. So I'm assuming there that they're talking about the necessity for having longer term budgets so that you can actually plan for 3, 5, 10-year projects. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair statement.
And would you agree with me that when looking at something as challenging as the Strait of Georgia and as challenging as other coastal waters, and in particular any kind of ecosystem-based management for sockeye salmon, we're going to look at those kinds of longer windows in order to be able to do the work we need?
I certainly hope we are.
And so one of the suggestions or recommendations that you might want to give to the commissioner is to look closely at how science budgets are looked at in this circumstance. And he is looking at budgets, and you have experienced this, Dr. McFarland,
yes.
And it's useful that in order to actually implement these types of objectives, not only do we need to shift in thinking, but we need to shift in how we budget them.
At this point in my career, I will agree entirely with what you just said, that I think we really need to ensure that science, since we're talking science right now, has funding on a time frame that will allow them to complete some of these longer-term projects, absolutely.
All right, and then I want to go to 2 more bullets down from that. They list the importance of there needs to involve stakeholders, and I'm assuming when science uses the word stakeholders, they're at least talking, including First Nations in that sentence. Is that correct?
I believe they are.
In the development of an ecosystem-based management process as soon as possible. Now, I just want to drill down on that. I was going to wait for a while, but let's just get right into this. A management process requires an understanding of what you're assessing. I mean, an assessment doesn't start before management. You've got to have an iterative relationship. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so when you're developing your models and you're looking at all of that, you need to know who's going to use those models and for what purpose and what are the issues. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair statement.
And that in the development of those models, there's going to be policy decisions that are going to have to be made in terms of priorities, in terms of funding, in terms of all of those kinds of things. Would you agree with me on that?
Absolutely.
Dr. Christensen, would you also agree with me on that?
Absolutely.
All right, and so if we're looking to make these models useful for First Nations and stakeholders, they need to be involved from what I call the get-go, right from the beginning. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair statement in terms of, particularly when we're talking ecosystem-based management research type approaches, yeah?
And right now, that's also going to require a bit of a shift in how DFO operates within your organization, because if science is doing some of these, tends to rely on managers for that. Is that correct?
Tends to rely on managers.
Managers
for what?
for discussing policy issues with First Nations.
Oh, I think that's fair too, yes.
Right. So you're not having discussions with First Nations about the kinds of data or the kinds of indicators that they would say is important as part of an ecosystem-based management, are you?
I think some of the groups work and have meetings with First Nations that would lead to that type of thing. Some of the Pelagics, the herring groups, meet routinely with First Nations groups to look at proposed herring issues within their zones, plus or within their traditional grounds, plus where research should be directed. Other groups also do that. Some of the I think it's fair, and you can question the next panel member on that, but I think there probably is some contact with in the invertebrate groups, the shellfish groups that are the same. In terms of, are they brought, have we brought everybody together to try and develop a conceptual ecosystem-based list of indicators, which include both science type indicators and social or economic or any other type of indicator? I think it's fair to say no, we haven't done that.
That work hasn't been done, but I don't want to make the distinction between science and social here, because from a traditional ecological knowledge perspective, it's very ecological. First Nations have a lot to offer, I would suggest, to science. Would you agree with me from an ecological perspective?
Yeah.
So we don't want to just separate them out in the culture, and you agree?
Yeah, and I'm used to talking science, so I'm suggesting that the science indicators, I'm trying to separate the ecological management type indicators, which would include exactly the types of things you're talking about, from the kind of the pure science indicators, which are measurements of wind patterns, and that's just where I come from. I may be wrong on that.
No, you may not. I'm just going to ask you to be more inclusive. That's a little bit more challenging for science right now, but from a traditional ecological knowledge perspective, one of the challenges for scientists and in how they operate is to include that knowledge early into the process. Would you agree with that?
I think that's a fair statement.
And that's something we're going to need to improve on.
Yes, I think that's a fair statement, and I think it applies to not only First Nations, it applies to other user groups where we possibly should open those discussions a little earlier in the process.
And I wonder if I could go to page 83 of this document now. And Mr. Commissioner, at page 83, you'll see a Canadian case study with and witnesses rising from the Arctic. And I'm wondering, Mr. McFarland, if you'll review that, you'll agree with me that that looks like a case study in which community members who are relying on fishing for subsistence in their daily lives were actively involved in the development of the models and in the monitoring. Is that correct? If I read that right?
I don't know, I haven't read it in detail yet. I assume you've read it right, yeah?
Are you familiar with the work that's been done in the Arctic, working with First Nations and otherwise to actively partner with them, not as clients, but as partners in a high level of with a high level of consultation so that the work can be implemented on the ground in a useful way?
I'm familiar that this type of thing work has gone on, this joint and partnerships have gone on in the Arctic, yes. I know both of the authors of this report, and I've worked with them for years. Now, it was 30 years ago, but...
May I mark this as the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit 818.
I think I'll now go to your work more locally, Mr. McFarland, and Exhibit 812 and 811 are the two exhibits we'll go back to. Now, as I introduced myself today, I introduced the fact that I work for 3 of the Saanich tribes, and when I reviewed this material, and it's my understanding, this really is work that's now being done from a science perspective in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Is that correct? That this has been a science initiative that was completed within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
I think that's correct.
And I didn't see anywhere in which you were able to, I'm not saying that it suggested you didn't want to, but that you were able to actually engage the Saanich tribes or any of the First Nations who care very much about the Strait of Georgia in the development of your indicators. Is that correct?
Well, first off, these aren't my indicators. This is a report that's been done by the people working on the framework for managing the Strait of Georgia. I'm not involved in this particular thing other than early on I was there. However, I think that's fair to say that this is mainly a science initiative at this point, and that I don't think there was an awful lot of consultation prior to it. It's a pilot study that was set up in order to basically to determine whether or not that this was a reasonable approach to take and try and work out some of the techniques that would be used for future ecosystem frameworks.
And at page 2 of Exhibit 812, there's a clear acknowledgement, as I read it, that the development of a comprehensive ecosystem approach requires collaboration among other DFO sectors and with external partners and interested parties. Again, I don't see First Nations listed there, but is that who you mean when you refer to external partners, or when the authors would have referred to external partners and interested parties?
I think so, yes, absolutely. It would, I think at the stage that they develop the actual ecosystem approach, particularly as we're talking defining the objectives and the ecosystem management objectives, you would be looking at all interested in parties, and First Nations would be a major component to that, I think.
I struggle with this notion that once you've done stuff, you're going to figure out that at the time of the assessment or later you're going to ask First Nations. How do you know what to assess if you haven't figured out what people are interested in?
This particular program is trying to set up if you want to call it, a snapshot of what we know and the structure of the Strait of Georgia ecosystem now, and where it might go in the future under certain types of perturbations, perhaps. And I mean, you're correct in saying you can suggest bringing in people earlier in the process. That could be a good thing. From the science perspective, though, we're trying to get at the actual structure of the system and make it operational. In this case, develop the monitoring tools that are appropriate from a physical, including physical oceanographic, climate and biological oceanographic indices, set up long-term monitoring programs, make sure they can become operational, that the funding is there to continue this work, and then to pull together all the information we can in the biological system, link it to the physical system, and develop models that give us a reasonable approximation of how the system might work. At that point, you then can start using this type of information. It becomes one of the inputs to an ecosystem-based approach to management as opposed to the assessment of the system.
Okay, I'm going to go one step further with you, and then I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Christensen, for a moment. But if we could now go to Exhibit 811 and go to page, on the hard copy, page 3. Sorry, Mr. Lone, I don't know what the PDF number is. It's in a section called Why the Need for an Ecosystem-Based Approach to the Strait of Georgia, and it looks like there's a to-do list on page 3 for science. If you could just review that, Dr. McFarland. Again, you'll see my concerns. It appears that science is going to set the objectives and develop the indicators and develop the risk-based frameworks. Why is it that science is doing all of this work by themselves?
Science is identifying the priorities for science alone in support of the ecosystem-based management. I don't believe that science ever intends or ever intended to develop the priority areas for the ecosystem-based management objectives. So science can, are setting themselves internally some objectives that they think will provide the best information for a large group of clients or stakeholders or interested parties or the public in general, that will help them to identify management objectives and help them to develop a management strategy.
Dr. Christensen, from a more academic perspective and perhaps from a more broader based rather than just the Department of Fisheries and Oceans here, have you found that when developing models for managers, it's useful for the managers to be involved in choosing the objectives and the indicators with you, working collaboratively with you in the development of the model?
We have often done so and found it very useful. It is I must just say it's a requirement, but it certainly facilitates it. It makes it much more relevant if that happens.
And in fact, in the application of the model and the collection of the data and the follow-up questions is extremely useful for those that are going to use it to be involved in the development of it. Is that correct?
Yes, and this also goes with regards to indicators, which I presume did you just step by that, or are we still talking about indicators?
Sure, we can talk about indicators included in that list.
That would be another area. What we've seen here is an internal DFO activity, as you have pointed out. There was parallel activities to this that involved academia and the global environment, and the DFO activities related to that. But what we've seen here is really very specific on the science part. It totally lacks the other aspects of what goes into ecosystem-based management, and that's an area where DFO really needs to make progress. This was pointed out in the PICES 2010 report that we talked about yesterday. Very little is happening on implementation of integrated management here, including on identification of indicators. Much more consultation is needed there as well. I totally agree with that.
And is it your experience that those that carry from time immemorial local information about the ecological state of affairs could be very useful when developing indicators?
The people who know about the ecosystem and the management issues certainly needs to be involved in this process.
Dr. McFarlane, I hope you don't take from my questions a faulting. I'm not intending to communicate that, but rather that is not typically how science and Department of Fisheries and Oceans have developed their work, and that this is a new challenge for you. Is that correct?
Incorporating non-GFO...
Traditional ecological knowledge from the base, from when you begin to do your work. So when you begin to look at the indicators, when you begin to identify where in the environment you want to create data. I mean, here you are with the Strait of Georgia. You've gone quite a bit far. You're leading the edge. We're getting reports, and there's no indication that you've taken the first step towards communicating with the Saanich tribes on how to bring that, how to ground truth that work from the get-go.
I think that's fair that at this stage, that type of dialogue has not taken place. As I say, this is a pilot study to try and determine the best way of moving forward. I presume that the people leading this work will learn from the process and will modify future strategies or development of future strategies to incorporate the concerns of numbers of people.
Then if I may, can I take you to page 28 of this same document and over to page 29 when we're talking about governance issues for ecosystem-based management. In particular, there's an example from Australia and the Great Barrier Reef. I'm not sure, Dr. McFarlane, whether you're familiar with that, but it appears that they were working closely with the communities. This transformation has necessitated for increased pressures on the Great Barrier system from terrestrial runoff, overharvesting, global warming, and the recognition of a new sense of urgency. The new strategies involved internal reorganization and management innovation. Carrying on from there, and would you agree that that's the type of thing that DFO is going to need to look at when collaborating and trying to develop ecosystem-based management approaches and operationalizing them on the ground?
I would certainly agree that is one of the ways of moving forward with this type of approach. And at the present time, DFO is structured in such a way that it's more along species or lines as opposed to area or issue lines, and there's been talk back and forth about how best to overcome that. One of the ways to try and do that was to bring together multidisciplinary types of programs that would include a number of different disciplines to address these things, but it's in its infancy, no question.
All right. One other place that I wonder if you'd like to comment on, Dr. McFarlane, is that my clients often experience a challenge when working with DFO and DFO scientists when trying to push them into looking at things broader and more ecosystem-based, is DFO's attachment to historical time series data. And in particular, the scientific comfort that you get from historical time series data. Would you agree with me that when moving into ecosystem-based management, we're going to have to prioritize the collection of other data than what we've historically been collecting, particularly as it relates to sake abundance data is what we've been collecting over the longest term. Is that correct?
Well, I certainly agree that we have to look at, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having historical
No, I'm not
data
suggesting
to deal with. But to move to other types of data support, yes, absolutely. There's no question. But long-term data series are very useful, as are any other type of data that you can use to ground truth any of the things you're looking at.
And prioritizing the collection of other data that is necessary will also be important.
I think so.
Now, I want to briefly turn to the recommendations in this report and ask you, Dr. Christensen, you begin in your recommendations with the collection of data, and then you go to food habits and diet database and concerted efforts in the marine, and then end with the ecosystem model. Were you suggesting that this is a linear approach, or would you agree with me that this is completely iterative and needs to be implemented in an iterative manner?
Yes, you would probably start with the last one, because that one will influence what kind of data you need to collect.
And in that last one, and in order to move it out of academic and into operationalizing, would you also agree with me that to develop an ecosystem model, it would be very useful to ensure that all of those that will be relying on that model are involved in it? And would you like to add that to the recommendations that you've put forward?
This is Exhibit 783 we're talking about now.
I wasn't there.
Sorry, yeah, I didn't think I needed to take you to the page.
Well, I lost the train there. Could you just repeat?
Will you agree with me that if in your view, we should begin by conceptualizing an ecosystem model for the Fraser River sockeye salmon or its habitats, or that to be useful, to make sure that we're using public money wisely, we should develop that model in a very collaborative way, including making sure that those that are going to rely on the model, including First Nations, are involved in the development of that model?
As a principle, yes.
Would you like to make sure that that's a is that something you'd like to add to your report? That's not something you mention in your report.
Our report, no, because our report deals with predation and the scientific aspects of that, and that's really what we focus on in the report.
No, but you can go much farther in your recommendations.
We can, and you mentioned before, well, I've advised a number of governments on implementation of ecosystem-based management, and what you're asking for certainly belongs in that context, implementation of ecosystem-based management. It does not belong in a report about predation. We were just sneaking in there what we're saying about ecosystem-based management because we thought it was important.
But it flows
But it's not the focus of the report.
But will you agree with me that when looking at predator-prey relationships in a modern context, you're pretty quickly going to go into an ecosystem-based approach?
The two are very tightly connected, yes.
Yes. So it's not that you were throwing it in. It's inevitable when looking at long-term predator-prey relationships in a modern context that you're going to look at it at an ecosystem-based approach. And in fact, it's my understanding from your work that it's actually the development of these types of tools can be extremely useful on a go-forward basis to not only build consensus amongst those that are trying to manage these fisheries, but also looking to adapt and change over time with the changing environments.
Yes, and when we develop these tools, our starting point is normally a number of policy questions. And those policy questions need to be developed in consultation with all interested parties.
All right. Sorry, Mr. Hume, I think you thought you might be finished, and I forgot to ask you a few questions earlier, and I want to pick up on those. And particularly, I want to talk about yellow perch in the interior lakes. Page 22 of the report, it talks about yellow perch being a competitor with salmon in the freshwater lake systems, and they've spread into the lakes in the Okanagan and the Thompson Shuswap, which are territories of my clients. And at the bottom of page 22, it states that the available information provides little support for the hypothesis that yellow perch were a major factor for sockeye survival trends over the last 3 decades. Mr. Hume, would you agree with that conclusion?
Yellow perch have only been found very recently in part of Adams Lake near shore, and I don't believe in any great numbers. So yes, as far as we know, the yellow perch are not a factor in the current regime.
I wonder if I could go to Commission tab 29 at page 10. If we've read this correctly, at page 10 of this report, it appears that yellow perch has been introduced in lakes in the Lower Mainland, the Fraser, and the Thompson. Have I read that correctly?
Sorry, whereabouts are we on here?
So if we look at the chart at the bottom.
Chart at the bottom. I believe that's correct. I'm not really totally familiar. I'm not really familiar with this report. But as far as I know, they're not. None of these lakes are sockeye rearing lakes.
As far as you know. Okay. And then at page 13 of this report, a model's been constructed which sets out the probability of the arrival, survival, reproduction, and spread establishment of yellow perch in different regions. And if you look at the Fraser River, Thompson, and Lower Mainland, it's high to very high. Now, I take it you weren't involved in these assessments?
No, I wasn't.
Are you confident, having seen these, that they are not in Fraser sockeye spawning lakes?
All the information that I have available to me says they're not there, other than, as I mentioned, Adams Lake.
I wonder if we could go to tab 7, our tab 7 or tab 2? Our tab 7. And perhaps you can just help me. It may be that these, again, are not in any way sockeye salmon rearing lakes. At the top of page 2, 3 particular lakes of concern in the Thompson River drainage, because it seems to conclude there that if the yellow perch enter the Thompson River drainage, the Shuswap Lake, there is considerable risk to the world-famous Adams River sockeye run, to a sizable interior Chinook population, and to the COSIWIC-listed endangered coho salmon.
If they do get into these lakes, yes, there would be.
And so they're already in the lower Shuswap River, it appears, and so this is something that we should be taking care
Sorry,
with.
where does it say lower Shuswap?
A second lake forest drains.
Gardam Lake, which flows into the lower Shuswap River.
Right, so they're getting close, is that correct?
They appear to be getting close, yes.
So would you agree with us that we need to begin to take steps to develop management plans for dealing with this invasive species as it relates to the at least the Adams River sockeye run?
I think it relates to all native fish species. Certainly we need to take steps.
And so, to your knowledge, has DFO moved forward in a management plan for invasive species such as yellow perch in these areas?
I really can't speak to that. I understand that they're doing work such as this paper here. I don't know what they've done in terms of management plans.
You agree with me that given the concerns I've raised with you here, that's something that's important to be looking at?
Yes, yes, I do.
One final question. Oh, can I have those marked as an exhibit?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Which one first?
Oh, both. The commission document first?
Tab 29?
Yes.
It would be 819. Your documentation at tab number 7 would be 820.
Question for you, Dr. Christensen, and this arose out of a comment you make at page 79 of your report, and I think it would be useful to go to there now. Now, did I hear your evidence yesterday correctly that you aren't actively involved and haven't been actively involved and don't have a lot of information about the wild salmon policy? Did I hear that right, or?
That's correct.
All right. Perhaps you can explain to me what you meant in the sentences that begins, the focus of fisheries management on short-term tactical advice, and we've spent a little bit of time yesterday on that. I want to go further. EBM calls for evaluating trade-offs which may be severe and which in turn have socioeconomic consequences. You suggest that such trade-offs are seemingly ignored in the wild salmon policy. I was concerned about that. If we can go to the wild salmon policy, and perhaps that's Exhibit 8, you go to page 14 of the wild salmon policy, there's lists of objectives, and that includes maintaining habitats and ecosystem integrity, and all of those all require trade-offs, doesn't it? Don't they?
They do. One thing is the paper describing the wild salmon policy, another is the actual implementation of it.
But Dr. Christensen, you're not actively involved in that work. This is a very strong opinion. Where did your opinion, how did you develop that opinion?
That's a very good point. Maybe this is this academic, again, going off on a limb on something that I'm not a specialist on. It is my impression, and I should probably have been more careful in what I wrote there.
All right, so it may be that there are trade-offs implicit all throughout the wild salmon policy, and what we're doing is being challenged by their implementation. Is that perhaps a more accurate way of looking at it?
That is possible. As you point out, I am not an expert on the wild salmon policy.
So I noticed that that at the beginning of your acknowledgements, that you acknowledged quite a lot of conversations with Dr. Carl Walters. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. But I do not recall any discussions about the wild salmon policy.
Oh, so this isn't Dr. Walters' concerns about the wild salmon policy that we're reading here?
I do not know Professor Walters' concern about the wild salmon policy.
All right, so these are your concerns.
It also relates to how DFO has been moving on implementation and incorporation of social and economical aspects of integrated management. And what I have read there, for instance, from the PISIS report, is that this work is at a standstill. So I have, as an outside observer, seen little progress.
All right, so let me just conclude with this question or suggestion to you, is that implicit in the wild salmon policy are many trade-offs, and that in the work of creating the wild salmon policy, trade-offs were already determined, and that the challenge is implementing the wild salmon policy, not working out all the trade-offs.
Was that a question?
Yeah, I'm asking you, you've suggested that there's no trade-offs in the wild salmon policy, and I find that suggestion, and my clients find that suggestion troubling. The wild salmon policy reflected a shift in approaches to the management of the wild salmon, and implicit in things like habitat integrity and making that and many of the objectives that are set out are trade-offs. You'll agree with me on that?
Oh, yes.
All right. Those are all my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gardner. Mr. Timber, re-examination.
Mr. Commissioner, I have 5 questions, 5 topics for re-examination. For Mr. Hume, sorry, you were just asked about invasive species. Who at DFO is knowledgeable or is responsible for the invasive species in the BC interior?
Barry Rosenberg would be one person be knowledgeable, and Mike Bradford.
Okay. Can you just describe, for the assistance of the Commissioner, a bit more about the work that they do? Can you provide a summary of their work, just as an overview?
I can't really speak to Mr. Rosenberg's expertise. He's area manager, or area chief,
Right.
and so therefore responsible. Dr. Bradford authored a number of the it's obviously not SARA. The number of the number of the reports on various invasive species in BC.
And Dr. Bradford's watching today, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
Okay. Mr. Hume, earlier Mr. Harvey was asking you some questions about over-escapement and about the size of smolt that result from years with large brood years, and he suggested that the resulting smolts were weak or less robust. So my question for you is there any evidence that smolts migrating from large broods are inherently weaker or less robust than in years where the runs are smaller?
There is a size density relationship, so that's larger escapements. The smolts tend to be somewhat smaller than big escapements. Certainly in this 2002 brood year from Quesnel Lake, the fall fry that we measured were definitely smaller than anything we'd seen in the previous years, indicating that they were not as healthy.
Okay, and so and that's the evidence you have with respect to whether they're inherently weaker or less robust?
That's correct. We haven't actually looked at energy content of any smolts in any system.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
We haven't examined energy content of smolts. All the information, basic information we have on smolt robustness, their condition is size, and it is size data.
Okay, so that's all the information we have. And Mr. McFarlane, Mr. Harvey was asking you about a question as to whether or not whether or not there should be a scientist in chief to draw science information together. And so I guess my question is, and I think this question was posed to Dr. Christensen. So my question for you is, in your opinion, would it be assistance to have a scientist in chief?
I guess in theory we do have a scientist in chief. Our regional director of science would fill that role.
And that's Dr. Laura Richards?
Yes. There are, when you're trying to develop programs and prioritize them in some way, I find it useful to bring in, much like we talked about just previously in the ecosystem-based approach, is to bring in the groups of people who would be most knowledgeable and most able to help us develop a science program based on whatever long-term requirements are needed to keep some of these programs going, and also the short-term needs, which would be based on things that could come from industry or First Nations, or that they have specific questions about specific stocks or specific areas for various species that you might want to address. They would be brought forward through management groups or through advisory processes, and then prioritized within some sort of committee that would look at that. And that's generally the way marine fish has progressed and operated. I'm not familiar. I don't deal with salmon, so I'm not involved in that.
And Dr. Christensen, you stated that in general, that when two fish meet, that the smaller one tends to become prey of the larger one. You made a statement about large fish generally eat smaller fish in your examination, in your earlier testimony. But will you agree that predator-prey interactions are not determined by size? Instead, their interaction is determined by their morphology, which is their shape, form, and structure, and their behavior?
No. I don't know any cases where a smaller fish... Okay, with fish, yes, I don't know any cases. It's true that you can have marine mammals where the prey is bigger than the predator. So on that point, I have to say, yes, you're correct. There are a number of factors that influence this.
Right. And you'll agree that many large fish are planktivorous and do not eat other fish?
Oh, absolutely. The biggest ones are only planktivorous.
Right. So I just wanted to, we just need to be a bit careful that it's not always the case that when a large fish runs into a smaller fish, the smaller fish becomes prey. You agree with that?
Yes, a very important detail.
And I'd like to take you, following up on the question with respect to the wild salmon policy, if we could turn to Exhibit 8, Mr. Registrar, and page Roman numeral 6. I think that's page at the beginning. If we could go back one page. Thank you. And then if we could go to, with respect to this issue, Ms. Gartner just stated that it was implicit within the wild salmon policy that there are trade-offs in the decision-making, and I'll suggest to you that it's actually explicit in the wild salmon policy that trade-offs are to be made. And I'll just read the fifth bullet down. Implementation of this policy will involve an open and inclusive process aimed at making decisions about salmon stewardship that considers social, economic, and biological consequences. People throughout BC and Yukon will contribute to decisions that reflect society's values for wild salmon. And then I'll read the 10th bullet down, the second last one. The policy aims to maintain CUs, but recognizes there will be exceptional circumstances where it is not feasible or reasonable to fully address all risks, Where an assessment concludes that conservation measures will be ineffective or the social or economic costs to rebuild a CU are extreme, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans may decide to limit the range of measures taken. Such a decision will be made openly and transparently. So will you agree with me that that it's explicit within the wild salmon policy that trade-offs are to be made?
Yes, and meanwhile, I've had the chance actually to read the statements that Councillor Gardner was referring to before. And just for the record, what I'm talking about there is socioeconomic consequences and that form for trade-offs. And my implicit critique of that is that I do not see, especially in connection with weak stock, any clear numbers for what the consequences are of the weak stock management decisions. That's what I was referring to in the report when describing that trade-off were not fully considered there. But yes, there are words about this. There are mentioning about trade-offs, and trade-offs are important in the wild salmon policy. That's correct.
Thank you. Those are my only questions.
Thank you, Mr. Timber. Mr. Commissioner, I have 3 questions. It'll just take a few moments, I think. Mr. McFarlane, if I may start by addressing a question to you arising out of the questions that Mr. Timberg asked you yesterday. You were commenting on the expert report from Project 8, and you indicated you would add to the species to be considered hake, dogfish, and pollock. You then addressed the why for dogfish, but not for hake and pollock as possible sockeye predators. Could you just fill us in then on what aspects of hake and pollock would cause you to include them in the list?
I think I was referring to Mr. Timberg asked me about where would I develop a program to address potential impacts on Fraser River sockeye. I would look at the timing is crucial, which would be the spring period, spring to early summer period. And the types of information is crucial, which would include physical all the way up to higher trophic level information. Of the higher trophic level information, the species that were identified were things like hake, dogfish, and pollock, and I think those are reasonable species to continue getting work on because they are not only potential predators, and although at this point in history, I don't believe that Pacific hake is a predator of sockeye. It's in the Strait of Georgia. There's been a tremendous decrease in size at age over time since 1992, and they are well below the limit that we ever find fish in the diet. But that can change again, as it did in the early 1990s. So I think you would want to have a program that was at least able to examine future changes in size at age and other biological parameters for that species. There's very little known about pollock. It's known it is a fish predator, but it's not a major predator of salmon, at least historically, either in Canadian waters or U.S. waters, where the major stocks are. The Strait of Georgia fish are much smaller than the, say, Gulf of Alaska or Bering Sea fishes, or some of the other stocks in Canadian waters. But again, it's good to have some of that information available for people. We don't have recent abundance information for either of those species. And you would want abundance information both as a potential predator if you truly believe that they were impacting, and as a competitor in order to assess the impacts of their competition with salmon. So that was the reason for those species. I added other species to the list as potential competitors. They're important species in the Strait of Georgia. There's virtually no research going on them, and everything that we know about them, it comes from incidental information that we collect during other surveys. And the two I mentioned specifically were Leuroglossus and Nyctophis.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. Having heard those comments, do you have any observations on those issues?
No, these are useful comments.
Thank you. Mr. Hume, in discussing the relationship between pike minnow and sockeye in Cultus Lake, is there any data on the actual amounts of sockeye consumed by pike minnow in Cultus Lake?
Not in recent years, no. We've had quite a bit of difficulty getting at reliable diet data. However, Dr. Ricker, back in the 1940s, did collect a considerable amount of diet data for northern pike minnow.
Would you agree with the judgment in the report that's been filed that updating diet data would be a very good thing?
It would be useful. It's difficult to get, given the low numbers of sockeye in the lake, it's difficult to get information on what their predatory rate would be. But yes, it would be useful.
Yeah, thank you. Finally, Mr. Hume, I wonder, Mr. Elon, I'm going to take you by surprise. I apologize. If you could look at Poll Exhibit 748, which is the expert report on Project 10. And at page 4, I just want to read a brief quote. It's the last full sentence above the recommendations. Thus, or last few sentences, thus the recent decline in productivity for Quesnel sockeye might be more attributable to increased spawner abundance than to broad-scale environmental factors that affect other sockeye stocks in the Fraser and other regions. However, other Fraser sockeye populations do not show such evidence. Our data do not support the hypothesis that large spawner abundances are responsible for widespread declines. You were asked some questions by Mr. Harvey about these issues, in particular with respect to Quesnel Lake, and the suggestion from, as I read the report of Peterman and Dorner, is that this may be limited to Quesnel and not something where there's similar evidence from other Fraser River sockeye lakes. Would you agree with that?
I guess the short answer is yes. Quesnel Lake, the lower trophic level productivity of the lake has not decreased, according to the sampling that we've done on the lake. However, the returns from since 2002 on the dominant and subdominant years have been lower than expected, lower than what return rates are lower than what we've observed in past years. That appears to be, I'm not sure if we can attribute that to freshwater production or marine survival problems.
And has the same phenomenon been observed in other Fraser River lakes?
No, it hasn't to date.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Mr. Commissioner. It's now 12:25. Perhaps this would be a convenient time to break. Could we start a moment or two, sort of a bit early at 2 o'clock?
We'll start at 2 o'clock, and we'll have 2 hours this afternoon for that final witness, Mr. Wallace. Before we break, I want to thank the panel members very much for your attendance at this commission, for answering the questions of the council, and for your cooperation in that respect. Thank you all very much.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.